Okay, so you should be seeing the front page of my inspection. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining me tonight. My name is George Datto. I'm the current CCBA president, and I'm excited to spend the next hour or 90 minutes talking to you about something that's become sort of top of the mind for me about hive inspections and a particular type of hive inspections called sort of informative hive inspections, like how to think about your hive inspection in a certain way that allows you to make key management decisions from the information you gather. Uh, so we used to do a lot more of these in the past. So I want to start by saying that, you know, any CCBA member who thinks they have something to present to the group, uh, surely Donna would like to hear from you at meetings, but sometimes, you know, we can do stuff outside of meetings too. So if there's somebody on the Zoom tonight who wants to talk about a particular topic or something like that, just let me know, and surely we'd like to do more of these Zooms in between meetings. So again, everybody's welcome to present. A little bit of background on myself and why this topic has become sort of important to me is that prior to about 3 or 4 years ago, I was an academic pediatrician. So most of my job was involved in teaching residents, pediatric residents, how to sort of take care of sick kids in the hospital, right? So they were with me for 3 years where, you know, I was given the opportunity to teach them how to assess and how to make management decisions. And this was important, right? Because this is like, surely beekeeping is not pediatric health, right? So there's definitely two. They're not trying to equate those two by any means, but there was a process, you know, and it generally took the residents 3 years to learn how to do that process. And some were better at the end of 3 years than others, right? So you know, it was important for me to teach them because eventually at night, the most senior person in the hospital was often the third-year resident at a certain point, right? At some point, the attendings get to go home. You figure like, okay, everything's stable. Whatever time it is, 8, 9, 10 o'clock, you're going to go home and get to sleep because you're no longer a resident. But then you leave the residents in the hospital at night. Some of you in healthcare probably understand that, you know, and have been in those scenarios. Well, that's when the blank hits the fan often, and you kind of learn quickly which residents you can trust and not, because, you know, they'd call you up at night and they start talking to you about what's going on. And some would present in a very organized, understandable fashion and then tell you what they need to do. And some would call you, oh, this kid's sick, I don't know what to do. I was like, no, you got to fill me in with a little bit more information. You know, I mean, please, let's back it up and go through the process, right? And sometimes they were able to go through the process and arrive at a decision. And sometimes it's 1 o'clock in the morning and I'm throwing on my clothes and getting back in my car to see what's going on, you know? So I feel like, and you know, in beekeeping, there's no training. You know, you get a hive. A lot of you got your hive all in the last couple of weeks. If you're a new beekeeper, you've gotten a package or you've gotten you shook the bees into the box, and now you're responsible for their management. And that's, you know, that's you know, I never want a first year resident responsible for anything in the hospital at any point. So, you know, so I'm going to hopefully present a way to think about your hive inspections and what questions you want to answer from them. Now, none of this is going to be the end all be all of making anyone a great beekeeper, right? So making yourself a great beekeeper, just like making the residents that ended up being phenomenal residents, they read, they showed up, and they wanted to be involved, right? That's what made a good resident, honestly. They read their stuff, they knew their stuff, they wanted to get involved, you know, and they grew. And the same way with beekeeping, it takes years to really become proficient at this. You know, even good beekeepers, and I'll admit it, you know, those of you who know me well know I'll be the first one to stand up and tell you all the stupid things I've done in my beekeeping over the years. And I've made some mistakes over the past year, some pretty big mistakes over the past year, honestly, on management decisions. So even experienced beekeepers make management decision mistakes that oftentimes result in the hives dying, right? So I think if you're really good if you're really, really good about your management decisions, you probably should have about a 10% hive loss every year. Now, that kind of doesn't mean much if you're running 3 hives, right? I mean, that you could lose 1 hive and be 33%, but the reality is, even myself would have lost that hive. But in general, over time, you should not lose a lot of hives if you're really skilled at assessing and managing your hive. So with that as an introduction, again, thank you for being here. I'm going to present the slides, and then we will obviously, if anybody has questions, type them in the chat. But I'll tell you, I'm flying this alone tonight, so I'll probably read through the chat questions at the end of the talk. So just type them in the chat or hold on to them, and we'll get to them. So what's the purpose of a hive inspection? Hive inspections are an essential part of keeping bees. You generally don't keep bees in a hive and just let them be. There may be some people that are practicing more natural beekeeping and maybe try to go into their hives less, but I even think natural beekeepers would agree that they need to go into hives and see what's going on. Hives, if you don't want to get into your hives and mess with bees, you probably should let them live in trees. Part of the hive inspection is assess what's going on with the colony, what's going on inside the hive, and then therefore inform you what to do. A lot of it is observational, a lot of it is learning. And ultimately, this is a hobby for 99% of the people in the CCBA. And I would say almost 100% of the people in the CCBA, it's a hobby. Some of us would like to think we're making some money off beekeeping. Maybe. A lot of us are spending money on beekeeping. Maybe some of us are making some money on beekeeping, but I think ultimately it's a hobby. Most of us have earned our income in some other way or in some other thing. So you want to be able to say, I'm having fun doing this because it is a hobby. So what's an informative, like I'm calling this informative inspections. Why is it informative different than just a regular old hive inspection? Because when I'm thinking about informative, I want to collect information that's useful. Sometimes the residents at night would be telling me about the kids in 4th grade and gets all A's. I was like, yeah, that's nice. But, I mean, we're 2 o'clock in the morning and the kid's, dying. I don't know if I need to hear about his social life at 2 a.m. But so you want to sort of think about information that's useful, and information that's actionable. Like, can I do something about the information that I'm collecting? And lastly, which is a little bit harder to appreciate when you first start, is information that assesses performance, right? So you're kind of assessing performance of both the honeybees and the beekeeper, honestly, in some ways. So what's going on in this colony? Is this a good colony? Is this a good queen? Is this not a good queen? Is this a strong colony and not a good colony? Was this a right decision as a beekeeper, not a right decision? So that's all information driven, but you have to know what to collect. So that's why I'm calling it information. Now, everyone's going to say this to themselves in their head 1,000 times. So when I talk about assessment, there's 4 things you want to assess when you go into your hive: bees, brood, food, and disease. Bees, brood, food, and disease. So when you open that hive to when you close that hive, you should not close that hive until you're able to answer or assess or tell me or tell yourself or tell somebody about these 4 things in that hive. And we'll go into a little bit more detail about how you describe and what you're looking for, but it's bees, brood, food, and disease. It sort of rhymes or something like that. So remember, we'll come back to it. Now, there's 4 management decisions that are crucial. So I'm throwing the hard stuff up front. It's going to come back at you, but you don't have to remember it right now. But these are the 4 questions that will keep your hive alive. Number 1 question: is the size of your hive appropriate for the size of the colony? It's a very important thing, and it doesn't get talked enough about, right? So those of you who just got bees, hopefully when you got your package of bees that covers 3 or 4 frames, or when you got your nuke that covers 4 or 5 frames, you didn't load up all your boxes and put the little tiny starter colony in all these boxes. I've seen it done. That's too much size, right? But hopefully, if you start your colony in a small box, when it starts to grow, you increase the size. So we'll get into how to make that decision. But number one is the hive the right size? Number two is your colony queen right? Number three, does the colony need to be fed? And number four is what is the mite count and intervention needed? So think bees, brood, food, and disease, right? They're the four things you need to assess. So you can kind of see how you're going to answer these four questions. If you assess the bees, you'll be able to answer, is the hive appropriate? If you assess the brood, you'll be able to assess if you're queen right. Assess the food, does the colony need to be fed? And do you have disease? What's your mite intervention? So when to inspect, when to do an inspection. Ideal conditions for an inspection are basically today, minus the eclipse, right? So you want your temperature to be 60 degrees. You want a bright and sunny day. And if you're retired, midday is ideal. Just because all the foragers are out and all the nurse bees are back and the hive's generally easier to work midday. What you want to avoid, and sometimes you can't avoid if you're running on a tight schedule, you want to avoid cloudy or rainy days, colder days, late in the day. You don't want to be wearing your black socks or just coming off, having any scents on you, because you're going to be more likely to have a difficult hive inspection, right? It's a lot easier to have an informative hive inspection when you're not getting lit up by bees, right? So even if a hive's nasty, I'm unlikely going to assess a very informative inspection. I just want to close it up and get out of there. So, but I think for the most part, if you pick your time correctly, you can have a nice condition to do a hive inspection. How often do you need to do a hive inspection? This is the time of the year, like March through May, where a lot of the key sort of decisions are being made. So you want to be in there more frequently. Surely once the swarm season's done and the nectar flow is over, like in the summer, maybe a little bit less frequently. And surely once winter comes, you really don't need to be in your hives very often. Now, is there a problem with going into hives too much? Because some new beekeepers, and practice makes perfect, right? You're only going to be good at a hive inspection if you go in there and do it. Probably not. Every time you go into a hive, there is a consequence of going into a hive. You have to disturb it. You're at risk for injuring the queen. The organization of that hive is probably set back a little bit in their foraging ability and what the work they're doing in the hive. So, but it's probably not going to necessarily compromise the ultimate survivability or function of that hive if you go in there too much. So probably not. Can you go in there too less? Absolutely. You could leave your hive in the back and not look at it for a couple months, and that's probably not the best idea of your management. So when I taught the residents, before you do a procedure, before you do something, the last thing you want to do is, and we used to do a lot of spinal taps, and I said, the last thing you want to do is go do a spinal tap and not have the right size needle. That's not a good situation when you're trying to do your work in the middle of the night, and sometimes you're just sort of running around and you're tired and you forget something. Well, same way with going out to your hive inspection. There's some very basic tools that you want to have to make it effective, and you don't want to leave any of them at home for sure. So one is some kind of protective equipment. I'm kind of known for wearing not enough protective equipment, but what you don't see is that I always have all my protective equipment close by. So if I need to put on a jacket, I have it. But usually a veil is going to be enough for me. So you want some sort of protective equipment. A hive tool is essential. It's hard to work a hive, no matter what hive you have, without a hive tool. A good smoker. I shouldn't say I never, because I do. But when I'm going out to work a yard, I always have my smoker lit. It's usually the first thing I do when I get to a yard is light my smoker and have it close by. It becomes your friend, especially if you're dealing with a hive that isn't very calm. I'm a big fan of a quiet box. So a quiet box is basically a nuke box with a number 8 hardware cloth on the bottom. You could put a outer cover on the bottom too. It's just somewhere that when you find the queen during an inspection, or you find a frame that you want to take a closer look at, it's just nice to sort of be able to put something in the quiet box, So I oftentimes, when doing a hive inspection, when I find the frame with the queen, that frame will go in the quiet box when I do the rest of the inspection, just because I don't need to obsess as much about rolling her or dropping her when I know she's in that quiet box. So I'm a fan. Um, you want some sort of record keeping. I know people are smirking at me a little bit because I was not a record keeper for a long time, so I'll admit it. I went back and I found this like nice journal that I had for my first year of beekeeping. It had all my hives and all my inspections, and it was all written out, pages and pages. And then I stopped doing it, and now they're back, right? So now I have very abbreviated hive notes. And the reason for that is because it said part of informative hive inspections is assessing the colony, right? And in order to assess the colony, you have to assess it over time. And my brain can't remember one colony for the next. So my notes are more sort of assessing the hive quality or the performance of that hive, more so than anything. And every once in a while, I'll write a note like, I made this intervention or that intervention, so I know what to do the next time I go in. So I've become a pretty big proponent of hive notes. Some people use apps. I'm not that technologically advanced or advanced in any way, so I still write my hive notes out. But there's lots of apps, and maybe we can get someone to share which ones they like, because I'm sure there's some real good ones out there. So that's it. That's your basic to be prepared. And again, the more prepared you are, the more successful you'll be, and the more fun you'll have. I did a little TikTok video. My on how to light a smoker. So let's go back and
all right.
Whoops, let me.
All right, so today George is going to show Amber here how to light a smoker.
Can you guys hear this?
See, George, what's your secret recipe?
A little bit of paper.
A little bit of paper.
Little paper.
Down the bottom.
A little bit of chemical-free burlap.
A little bit of burlap.
Layer.
So you like to layer it.
Layer is the key. Layering is the key to success. Pine needles don't make a difference what kind of pine needles, but pine needles work really well. Nice smoke. My favorite secret ingredient, sumac bud. Highly important.
Nothing's highly important.
We got a mix, a little seasoning mix here of wood chips and pellets.
Highly recommend pellets. Wood pellets, grass pellets, all kinds of pellets.
Just toss it all in there.
Toss it all in. And then at the very top, we got some green to make sure it's cool smoke. So we got some nice greens at the top.
Make sure you put green at the top. It's going to cool that smoke out. And it's also going to prevent it from flying out embers. So
here comes the moment to see whether or not this works, Amber.
Got this.
Amber's got the torch.
Go big or go home, right?
So we're going to light this smoker from the outside. He's going to torch it so it's nice and red, a nice red, so you got a red spot, and then she's going to go up and down. And then I'm going to smoke the smoker. Okay, Amber, I think we're good.
Wow. Looks good.
Looks great. Then we just give it a couple big smokes, couple big ones. Again, Amber lit it from the bottom, so it's going to burn from the bottom up. And I think this smoke is going to be lit for about an hour.
Good job, Amber.
Awesome job.
So there's lots of ways to light it. There's lots of ways to light a smoker, but your smoker is going to be your friend during your hive inspection. So make sure you have a smoker. I usually, when I get to the site, every hive gets a puff of smoke before I go into it. And really, a well-lit smoker should really last the whole time you're inspecting. So if your smoker is going out, practice. So the first thing I used to teach the residents about when you approach a sick kid, before you like start with your stethoscope or your otoscope or whatever you're going to do, you want to take a moment and get a general appearance of what's going on. This sort of like step back and just sense, like, is this kid okay or not? And that's going to be so valuable. It's not going to tell you what's right or what's wrong. You're still going to need to do the physical exam, but it's going to give you a sense. In the same way, when you approach your hive from the outside, take a moment. It should be strapped. I say that, and the raccoons destroyed hives at the apiary because I didn't have them strapped right, but they were strapped. But is your hive strapped? What is the hive configuration? What is the boxes? Is it 1 deep, 2 deep? Because you're going to have to answer that question eventually, right? Is the size of my hive right? So you want to take a moment and say, what's the size of my hive? Is there a queen excluder? What's directly beneath the bottom board? You know, the bees are constantly cleaning house, right? They keep a clean house. So you can notice that in most of my hives, I'm not going to say all, but in most of my hives, the ground is scalped right underneath the hive. So right underneath the hive, you won't find any grass. It's just dirt. And the reason for that is because I want to see what's dropping out of that hive when I come into the yard. So if I see pupae, if I see dead bees, that's a sign. I'm going to look at the amount of bee traffic coming in and out and kind of compare it. If there are other hives in the apiary, how does it compare to the other hives? Is there pollen coming in? Not that pollen coming in means that you're queen right, but you'd like to see pollen coming in. Is the ratio of workers to drones okay? Are all the bees coming back into this hive drones? Are they mainly workers? And is it different from the rest of the hives in the apiary? So this is just a quick picture of just normal kind of activity on coming out the landing board. Nothing special, but kind of what you'd expect. You want to take a look at your landing board. You know, most of the hives, not all of them, some of the horizontal hives don't have a landing board, but most of the Langstroth hives have a landing board. And that's that 2 or 3 inch space that the bees land on before going into the hive. And sometimes it provides clues to what's going on, right? In the fall, do you see a lot of yellow jackets going in and out of your hive? That's not a good sign, right? You should see honeybees going in and out of your hive. If you see a lot of yellow jackets, you're going to start to at least generate a hypothesis that maybe I don't have enough bees in that hive. Or maybe my bees are super friendly that they just let the yellow jackets in. Again, drones do come in and out of the hive. They have to fly. And yeah, drones generally fly in early afternoon, but it's still a minority of the bees that are coming in and out of the hive are drones. Most of them are workers, right? Inside a hive, 90% of the bees are workers, 10% of the drones. So if you look at the entrance and you see 50-50, you should think. Robbers is a classic one that takes a little bit of time to recognize, robbers versus regular bees, and we're not going to spend much time on that tonight. But again, something that you'll notice if you see it. And obviously, you don't want to see dead bees. A few dead bees are okay on the landing board. Surely bees die and inside the hive, and there's there's an undertaker that cleans them out, but you don't want to see a lot for sure. And then we already talked about on the ground. I really, you could put a stone underneath there. You could put a piece of carpet or a cardboard or whatever. I just take my weed whacker and scalp it because I'm not that organized. I find it useful just to see it. It's just to see if they're dropping anything out of that hive. And I was showing something on this hive. I think that this was some pupae dropped out. And I think that this may have been some chilled brood, honestly, that ended up because they didn't have enough bee coverage, and I think they were dropping some pupae. Now you could see that on hygienic bees, you could see that on hive beetles. It doesn't tell you what's going on, but if you start to see the pupae on the ground in front of the hive, it should raise suspicion. Some people use whiteboards. I tend to use more solid bottom board, so I'm not a huge screen bottom board whiteboard user. But there's some people that are really good at pulling out. It's kind of cool, right? Before you go into a hive, you just pull out the whiteboard and you see what's there, and it can give you some clues. Surely you could look at uncappings. That's what you want to see, right? Because bees are always either uncapping honey or the brood's being uncapped when it chewed out when it emerges. Sometimes you could see mites on the whiteboard. Surely you could see small hive beetles, and it took me a while to recognize. It's amazing what wax moth poop looks like. It actually looks like mouse turds almost. It's amazing how big the poop are of wax moth larvae. So you can see the brown cylindrical sort of things that you would initially think that was mice poop, but it's really not. It's wax moth. So this was a hive that I think had some wax moth damage going on. So I'm not a big whiteboard user, but if you're using them, take a look at it. Now, the whole idea, just like a general appearance is just to generate hypothesis, right? You're not, anything is really diagnostic from looking outside a hive, but it can notice which hive is different. It can slow yourself down. Make sure you just sort of smoke all the hives. Take a moment to observe all the hives before you just sort of dive in and start ripping open hives. But it does not replace the hive inspection, because you do have to open your hives to manage your hives. You can't do it from the outside. Okay. So we're prepared. We looked outside, and now we're going to get into our hive. So here's the moment of truth, and you're going to go back to, I need to assess 4 things. I need to assess bees, brood, food, and disease. So let's talk about bees. As soon as you open a hive, you're going to see bees, hopefully. You may not. And you're going to notice something as soon as you open the hive about the bees. You're going to know sort of what those bees sound like, what those bees' temperament are, as soon as you open that hive. It's worth noting, right? Because this is the assessment part of, is this a hive that I like, or is this a hive that I don't like working because they're awfully defensive? And not to say one time labels a hive as being defensive, but surely if you go in there 2 weeks and in 2 weeks they act the same, and you could listen to the sound of the hive and look at the bees and see how many frames they cover. So this is an average hive, nothing special about this colony at all. You could see the bees in the seams of the frames, and it's not a quiet colony, but it's not a very loud colony either. So the next thing you want to do is you want to assess the quantity, quantify the amount of bees in the hive. And that's generally referred to as frames or seams of bees, right? So when you hear people describe this is how many frames or how many seams of bees. And seams is the spaces in between the frames. So you can count how many spaces are filled with bees, or you can just generally look at the frames and say that there are 7 frames out of 10 that have bee coverage on them. Ideally, bees cover at least 70% of the frames in a hive, right? So if you open a hive and half the hive is uncovered by bees, that's less than ideal. If you open a hive and every single frame has bees on it and the bees are rolling out of the hive, that may not be ideal. Remember, there are about 2,000 bees per frame if the frame is covered with brood. So if you're trying to that's a deep frame, not a medium frame. So if you're trying to do a quick assessment of how many bees are in that hive, you can count the frames of bees and multiply by 2,000, and you'll get how many bees are in the hive. And a frame of cap brood, both sides. If you have a frame of cap brood that's had brood on both sides, when that brood emerges, it'll cover about 3 frames. So just sort of to think ahead a little bit, a deep frame, when emerged, we'll have about 6,000 bees emerge on that deep frame if it's covered in brood. So just to think ahead about, you're doing a hive inspection this week, but if you see 4 or 5 frames of fully capped brood, it gives you a sense of how much bee coverage that brood is going to take up in a few weeks when it emerges. So the general appearance of the bees. Bees behave very differently, right? So if you look at enough colonies, you're going to notice that the behavior on the bees is very different from colony to colony. Ideally, when you pull that frame out of that hive, you want calm, very calm, purposeful, confident bees, right? You don't want runny bees. You don't want loud bees. You don't want smelly bees. You want calm bees. You almost want to feel like the bees don't even care that you're there, honestly. And again, that's worth noting. Again, it comes back to assessing the hive. You want bees that are really calm. You can look at these bees. They're moving around, but they're not running. They're not all hyped up or running all over the place. They're quiet, calm bees, worth noting. Here's another colony. I was telling Jim before we got started. This is a colony. This fascinating story a little bit. At least I think it's fascinating. This was a hive that was at an out yard for the last 2 years. So You know, I have a bunch of out yards. This hive was sitting at an out yard. And I know it was a daughter from one of my breeder queens. So I knew she was a daughter. She was marked, and I knew she was there for 2 years. So, you know, this was her second year that she survived the winter, and she was always super calm, right? And I thought to myself, well, why don't you know? I like to breed. I like to graft calm bees. I like calm bees in my apiary. This may end up being my breeder this year, right? So look at that. Like they were like, whoops. They were like, they're like, they're like, it's like on the beach in Acapulco or something. They're just like totally chill. I was like, wake up, you know? So I was like, okay, this hive, if it survives, so I had in my mind last fall, this hive, if it survives the winter, it's going to come back to my home yard because it's going to be my breeder, right? It survived 2 years. It's calm. So it survived the winter, early March. It's still in one box. I bring it back to my home apiary. I was like, okay, you're going to be my breeder. You sit there. The last 2 times I've been in this hive, it's lit me up. I'm like, what is going on here? You know, and I'm trying to think, it's like, are they unhappy that they have a new location? It's the same queen. She's marked. I don't know. Anyway, but you know, this is interesting because my home apiary is right on a road. So I was like, are they really upset that I've moved them, you know, from where they were to where they are now? Who knows what it is? But anyway, here's what are these bees? You know, we talked about bees. You know, you surely want to look at how many bees, but you also want to look at, you know, the temperament, but you also want to look at what bees are doing, right? Because bees are cool. You know, let's take a look. Let's take a look at that bee. You know what that is, right? That bee on the left is like, oh, waggle. It's like doing that waggle dance and doing that figure eight, you know. There's a queen down there. Look at that queen. So that's the waggle dance. You know, that's usually and where the brood is, where the pollen is. You know, they're telling all the other foragers which way to go. I can't interpret what the waggle dance is. Tom Seeley could help you with that. And that's been described. Not too cool, but it's cool to see. But this was cool. So this is a hive on the right. So this is a hive that has an observation window in it, right? So I'm able to look into the brood nest through this observation window, right? So without opening the hive, I'm able to see the top bars of the frames of the brood frames without opening up. So take a look at this. You notice anything? Let's do that one more time. That bee right in the middle. Look at what that bee's doing right in the middle. I don't know. Some of you may recognize it. To me, that looked like washboarding, right? So I always thought like, hey, washboarding always occurs on the outside surface of the hive, right? They're outside of the entrance. It's usually happening in the middle when the humidity starts to pick up and they kind of go up and down behavior on the outside of the hive, right? I'm looking at this bee that's sitting. So this bee's doing the same behavior with its front leg going back and forth right on the top bar. This bee's washboarding the top bar too. So I was like, okay, well, washboarding is just not a outside the hive thing. It's an inside the hive thing. Now I told you you should observe things that are actionable, right? Well, this is not actionable, right? So, but this is cool. I thought I'd show you something that was a little cool, maybe not actionable. That they're washboarding inside the hive on wood too. So it has something else to do besides something else is going on when they're doing that. Maybe it's just neurotic behavior on bees. Maybe they're just a little obsessive and they just have to clean. And they just, if there's a wood surface, they go back and forth over the wood surface. I don't know. But no one understands exactly what washboarding is, you know. But I'm convinced now it's not happening just outside the hive. It's happening inside the hive. So again, we open a hive. We got to quantify the amount of bees. We're going to look at what the bees are doing. We're going to look at the general appearance of the bees. But the question really that's important is, do I need to change the size of my hive? Does it need to be smaller? I.e., it's going into winter, coming out of winter, post-swarm. It's got a small hive beetle infestation. The hive is too big. It's too big. You know, the bees coming out of winter at about 10,000 bees. Basically, hopefully, not my hives, but most hives are going to reach about 60,000 bees. kind of mid-May, and then they're going to go down to 10,000 bees in winter. To me, that means you got to change the size of the hive as the colony changes. One of the major things that I think people get into trouble with as new beekeepers is their hive grows, they make it big, they don't know how to do swarm control, the bees swarm, and then they're left with this small hive, small colony in a big hive that they don't reduce. And then hive beetles move in, and then it just is the downfall to why new beekeepers lose so many hives. And that's preventable, right? You can't prevent your hive from swarming, but you can definitely take a post-swarm hive and make it smaller. Now, there are times that you need to go big, right? There are times when you need to go big for sure. When the nectar flow is on in May, I assume the nectar is going to flow at some point this year, not recently, but it looks like today was a little bit better, but rain's coming back. That obviously, go big when the nectar flows on. When you got a growing package or a growing nuke, get larger. But again, do I need to change the size of the hive to the number of bees? Okay, bees brood. The second one is brood. If you work with Jeff Eckel's rule is I need to see 3 frames of brood. I think that's a good rule. You don't need to see every frame of brood, but 3 frames of brood will give you a good understanding of what's going on. When you're looking at brood, you're both looking at the quantity of brood and the quality of brood. So there's 3 kinds. There's 3 kinds of stages of brood, right? There's the egg. Eggs are hard to see. I tell people they look like a grain of rice. Initially, they're standing straight up, and then they lay down when they emerge into a larvae. Eggs are there for 3 days. If your vision's not great, or if you're not using black plastic, they can be hard to see. Larvae are 6 days. So larvae are basically the worm or the grub. You could see the progression of the stages of larvae on this slide. So you could see at the top their eggs, and then the larvae kind of are C-shaped, are comma shaped, and then C-shaped, and then they basically get a circle and nice and fat, and that's 6 days, and then they pupate or they cocoon for 12 days. So it's easy to remember. Basically 3, 6, 12, double each one. 3 days as an egg, 6 days in a larvae, and 12 days as a pupae. And you should be able to see all 3 stages of brood when you go into a hive to inspect. Now, a lot of people say they can't see eggs. That is true. And if your vision is like mine, not great, sometimes it's hard, right? So using black plastic foundation sometimes will help. So on your brood frames, I use black plastic foundation just to help myself out a little bit. And you want to inspect with the sun at your back. But honestly, oftentimes I'm just looking for royal jelly. So when I look at that frame, I'm just looking for that milky, shiny stuff that's on the bottom of the cell. And that's on day 1 larvae, so you'll see royal jelly on day 1 larvae, and you won't even see the larvae in there. But if you see that, you probably have eggs somewhere. So again, this is in a grafting cup. So this is grafting. So I took the larvae and the royal jelly out, but that's what's in the bottom of the cell is just that pool of royal jelly. And we won't get into the details, but that's also a good way to sort of assess the nutrition of your hive, is to look at the amount of royal jelly. If your hive is not making great royal jelly, it's nutritionally not adequate. If your royal jelly looks like that, you're in great shape. And like I said, seeing young larvae is often good enough if you can't see eggs. So most of us are familiar with the 2 brood types in a hive. There's basically worker brood and there's drone brood. The worker brood is flat. The drone brood is bullets. You're going to, again, see 90% should be worker brood, 10% should be drone brood. Most of the drone brood, unless you put a green frame, which forces them to lay drone brood, most of the drone brood is going to be on the outside of the brood nest. So you're going to see it on the outside frames. You're going to see it on the bottom of the frames generally. Why they stick the drone on the outside? Maybe they're able to, because they're a little fatter, able to tolerate colder temperatures a little bit, or cooler temperatures. So they go on the outside of the nest versus the worker brood on the center of the nest. I went into a hive today and I was like, the first frame I pulled was drone brood. I said, okay, this is the outside of the nest, but it had a lot of drone brood on it. Well, the next frame I pulled it, excuse me, I'm getting over a cold. Drone brood. Next frame I pulled drone brood. I was like, oh great, there's a drone laying queen in there. But anyway, just too much drone brood. The more you do, the quicker you get at that. But I'm looking at 3 frames of brood, and I should see 90% worker brood, and I didn't. So that's worker brood, drone brood, and then there's queen cells, right? Hopefully, you don't see a lot of queen cells in your hive, honestly. But you're looking for them, right? You're looking for them, and maybe you should look at more than 3 frames during swarm season, maybe, but 3 is probably enough. There's three types of and queen cells look like peanuts, basically, right? They look like a peanut that's hanging off the bottom or the surface of the frame. There are swarm cells, which are planned, which are on the bottom of the frame. And then there's emergency or supersedure cells, which are more on the face of the frame. And again, the size of the cells depend on the nutrition of the colony at the time that they were made. 16 days till emerge in a queen cell. So sometimes people say, I see a queen cell and there's nothing else around it. Well, that's a dead queen cell, right? Because queens emerge at 16 days, workers emerge at 21 days. So if you just see a queen cell and nothing, and it's capped and nothing emerged, then it's a dead queen cell. The queen, everybody wants to see their queen. I do mark my queens just because it gives me something to do. And I'm tend to move quickly, so it makes it a little bit easier, but maybe I've gotten worse at seeing unmarked queens. Queen is often found on a brood frame. I use queen excluders. I run single brood chamber, so I'm only looking through 8 to 10 frames for the queen, but she could be anywhere. If there is a lot of, if you're not running a queen excluder, she could be anywhere in the hive, but she definitely tends to be on brood frames. She's about 2 to 3 times the size of a worker bee. She's got a hairless thorax, longer legs. And again, a complete hive inspection does not need to see the queen. If you see eggs or if you see young larvae, you have seen enough. Talk a little bit about eggs and larvae really quickly. They should be pearly white. They should be single egg or larvae per cell. Whole frame at an angle to see them. They should be ivory white. You want to pay attention to color. You know, we're going to get to disease in a bit, but one of the characteristics of disease of some of the disease is that it affects brood, right? And some of it affects larvae, and they're going to make the larvae off-colored or unusually shaped. So you really want to glance at that larvae and make sure it looks exactly like this. It should look white, ivory white. What's this? Okay, so now you're looking and you pull up this brood frame. You're like, holy my, that's not good, right? So you got like 4, 5, 6 eggs per cell. Well, you know, that's not normal, right? So that's laying workers, right? So when you see multiple eggs per cell, you got problems with that colony. You may not know what to do at first or what to do about it, but you'll at least notice that I have multiple eggs per cell. Now, some people will say, yeah, not always, George, right? So when a queen first starts laying or coming out of winter, sometimes she'll lay 2 eggs per cell, sometimes, but they won't look like this. You won't confuse that situation versus a laying worker situation. So what's your question? Is your colony queen right? Very important, right? Is my colony queen right? When won't it be quite queen right? Post-swarm, we're not going to talk about post-swarm, but obviously if it swarms and the queen takes off, it's going to be a little bit of time before the new queen starts laying. If the queen's injured during an inspection, if you see emergency queen cells, the queen's not right. A failed split, you may try to make a split. People like making splits. They're already talking about making splits. And for whatever reason, that split doesn't work. That could be a queen queen loss. Laying workers, we talked about. Drone laying queen, we didn't talk about. But you want your colony to be queen, right? And if it is not that perfect management will make your colony queen right, but you're more likely to be queen right. So congrats if you are. This is where I failed miserably this year and multiple times is food. Bees need food. We sometimes forget that, right? I mean, they're in a box, but yeah, they need food. And their food depends on what's in the mile radius around the hive, right? So don't overlook this important piece of it, right? That the weather and the conditions sometimes will cause bees not to have enough food. So this is my own pollen sub. I was feeding bees like pollen sub and 1-to-1. So you can see their little proboscis coming out and they're sucking it up. They love food, so you give your bees food, they're happy for sure. So that's so there's short-term food and there's long-term food, right? And where you're going to see the food is in the brood nest, the short-term food. So their food is basically two things: their nectar, which is liquid, right? Which is their carbohydrate source. So, that they're getting from flowers. And then there's bee bread, or which is the protein, which is the pollen on the frame. So you have nectar and pollen, and there should be both of those on the frame. We've definitely come out of a rough stretch of 3 weeks of basically no foraging, and it's amazing. It's amazing. I'm not going to talk much about this, but I don't think we appreciate how much bees move stuff around the hive, their food sources around the hive, to put it where to put it where they need it. It's amazing. You'll have a frame of nectar and pollen on position 1 or 2, and you go in there a day or 2 later, it'll be gone. They'll have taken everything out of that frame and they'll have moved it to where they need it, to where the brood is. So they're constantly a factory going on in there where they need that raw material to survive, right? They need it to generate heat. They need it to do their own metabolism. They need it to raise brood. Yeah. And sometimes we're supplementing, right? If there's no nectar or bee bread, then we're doing sugar syrup or fondant or sugar bricks or pollen sub or whatever. And if you want to, again, I talked about that royal jelly. If you see a nice amount of royal jelly in the larvae, then you're probably fine. Again, so you're going to see the pollen and the nectar on the outside of that brood nest. So generally right now the brood frames can have some on it, but once the brood starts really to pick up, there'll be frames full of brood without any pollen or nectar on it. So you're going to have to look on the outside frames to see what stores they have. The long term is obviously honey. Honey reserves are there for not for short-term energy or short-term brood raising. They're really there for the dearth or post honey harvest or winter or starting new colonies. And generally honey's above the brood or behind the brood, but generally above the brood. This I took unfortunately took yesterday. So I went into this, I saw this hive, I looked outside this hive. I was like, shoot. And some people would say that's poisoning, right? But that's not poison, because the bees are stumbling and there's dead bees at the hive entrance and it looks like the bees have been intoxicated with something. And these bees are starving. So this is starvation, unfortunately. So this is a hive that probably was compromised probably for a few days, if not longer, and then just ran out of food yesterday, and I missed it. So this is what you're going to see outside a hive on a starving hive. So food. So assess food. What's your manager says, and do I need to feed? You probably need to feed when you're starting a new colony. I always say when you're starting a package or a new, feed them for a couple weeks. Probably a good idea, especially if you're asking them to draw a comb. If there's a dearth, which usually happens in the summer, maybe this year all this rain will cause our clover to bloom basically all summer, and there won't be a summer dearth. We'll see. We don't know. Got to be careful. You honey harvesters, me included out there. You got to be careful, right? You got to be careful how much honey you take, because they need something. They need something, especially when we're harvesting honey and they're going into that dearth and their colonies are big. Think about it. You may need to prep for winter. We're not going to talk about that, but the colonies definitely need so much carbohydrates to survive the winter. And this year, coming out of winter and early spring, when the weather sucks, basically 3 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks of no flight days and cold weather, they're going to run out of food quickly. No, when there's plenty of food sources in the hive and the sun is shining, you're okay. There's no need to feed, or when you assess the weight of that colony in winter and it's 80, 60, 80 pounds, they're fine. You don't need to feed them. They're going to be okay. Lastly, bees, brood, food, and disease. This is the hardest one for new beekeepers, but it's important. Every time I'm in a hive, I'm doing a unconscious or conscious assessment for disease. Again, I always tell the residents you have to look at a lot of normal before able to recognize abnormal. So a field guide is helpful, so Penn State puts out this honeybees and their maladies available on Amazon. I think we sell it at meetings for like 12 or 13 bucks or something like that. Definitely worth having. I think mentoring is key a lot. Jeff Eccles coming to inspect my yard. I look forward to it every year because I'm going to learn something about disease recognition from him. So there's brood diseases and bee diseases. So when you're looking for disease inside of the hive, you want to be looking at brood and at bees. So if you look at the hive on the frame on the left, it violates the first thing I tell you, larvae should be pearly white, right? So you're looking at this larvae and it's not white, right? It's like brown, tan. And if you look sort of at some of them, they're not C-shaped. They're kind of like squatted in the bottom of the cell, right? So you don't see shape. You don't see pearly white larvae. You don't necessarily have to know what this is. You just have to know that it's not normal, right? So I need to sort of take a picture of it with my phone, or I need to, get my guide out to look at what brood diseases there are. But this is European foul brood. So the discoloration of the brood and the corkscrew brood is foul brood. Now the hive on the right is another brood disease that's chalk brood. So chalk brood is something that you'll see in the spring. Sometimes you'll see it when the temperatures are cold and the brood is stressed. Again, it looks like chalk basically, and not normal larvae. So that's chalk brood. Excuse me, I'm getting out of this cold. So then you want to look at the bees too. And again, you're just scanning. And you're not going to pick this up when you're new, but if you scan enough hives, you're going to pick up things. Now, all hives are sick. All hives are sick. All of them. It's just the degree of how sick are they, right? Sort of like me. I got a cold, cough. I'm sick. I'm probably going to live tomorrow because I don't know why, but so far so good. But same way with bees, right? All bees. If you do PCR on a hive, you're going to see deformed wing virus on low levels in most hives, right? But you're going to see nosema in most hives. But it's going to be at a level where it's not going to affect the overall bee population and cause that hive to crash. But it may, if you see a certain number of bees or a certain percent of the bees becoming infected. Now, if you look at the picture on the left, you're going to see that this bee looks different than the rest of the bees, right? So what do you see? So you see a bee that's its thorax looks like a queen, right? So it's shiny, right? We already said queen thoraxes are shiny. All the other workers, well, most of the other workers have hairy thoraxes. This worker bee, not a queen. Worker bee's got a thin, oh my goodness, I coughed too hard and I compromised blood flow to my brain. Has a shiny thorax, so that's abnormal. If you look at this worker bee's abdomen, it's sort of short and stunted and it looks greasy. And you can see that there's sort of a bee on the bottom left that's sort of working on looking like this too. This is something called chronic bee paralysis. So this is a chronic viral, is it viral? I think it's viral infection. Usually you'll see a few bees like this, but sometimes it can really overtake a hive. Greasy, shiny, hairless bees. You think chronic bee paralysis. This is not going to be a talk on chronic bee paralysis, but it's a talk on making disease as part of your hive inspection. This one on the right, you could see the bee in the middle, right? That's hopefully you guys don't see much of this. This is deformed wing virus, right? So you're going to see these wings that are really shriveled up, and that's just a very sick bee that can't fly. You may, when you start to see a bunch of deformed wing virus, you definitely should be concerned that your bees are going to be in trouble. So again, when you're looking for disease, you're looking at brood and you're looking at bees. But the most important thing to screen for disease is to know your mite count. Is to measure mites, and you really should be measuring mites once a month, starting in May, maybe June, definitely, maybe May. It's simple to do. There's no reason not to do it. It's really going to give you the information you need to not fall behind on disease in your hive, right? So there's lots of videos out there on how to do a mite count. I use Dawn dish soap, 1 tablespoon per half gallon of water. I used isopropyl alcohol for a long time, but Dawn dish soap seems to work, and everything in beekeeping is getting more expensive. So I go with the Dawn dish soap method. You basically collect half a cup of bees in a mite washer. You cover the bees with the wash liquid, you swirl for a minute, and then you count the total number of mites on the bottom of a cup and divide by 3 to get percent mites, number of mites per 100 bees. Simple. Again, we'll probably have more tutorials in May and June about how to do this, but once you do it once, it's simple. So really, when you think about disease, I mean, you can see all kinds of things, but really it comes down to what's your mite count and do I treat? So if your mite count's greater than 2%, which would be 6 mites on a mite count, you definitely should treat. If it's between 1 to 2%, it sort of depends on what season you're in and beekeeper preference. If you're less than 1%, probably no. And if you're at 0%, congrats. Your hive's doing really well not to have any mites on a mite wash. Again, monthly thing, May, June, July, August, September, October. There are some people, that me included, that universally treat independent of mite counts. I don't think it's the right thing to do. I think the right thing to do is do mite counts monthly. Even if you're going to universally treat, you should know what your mite counts are. Most hives die from hive mites and their viruses, right? So if you know your mite count's low, you're gonna be assured that your hive is probably going to survive. So in summary, every hive inspection you need to assess 4 things: bees, brood, food, and disease. And you're trying to answer 4 questions. Is the size of my hive appropriate for the size of the colony? Is my colony queen right? Does the colony need to be fed? And what is the mite count? And is an intervention needed? And when you do this enough and get good at it, this takes time. You're not going to go out there tomorrow and do the world's best hive inspection, but you're going to have a framework of which to build it. And if you do it, your beekeeping becomes enjoyable, effective, and efficient, and you have fun. Otherwise, you kind of spin in circles like the resident. I hate being on call because I don't know what I'm doing, and Dr. Data's as mean as they come. I was like, no, I just need you to be organized. That's all. I don't want to come in at 2 a.m., but I will hold your hand if I need to, So I think that's a wrap for this, and hopefully it was enjoyable and effective and somewhat efficient talk tonight. So I'm going to open it up to questions. Now let me stop my share.